I was looking at my phone using an app to find free items being given away when I came across the ad for this edger. They said it starts and runs, but it smokes, which I guess was enough to scare most people not to bother with it. But it didn't bother me. I'd at least like to find out what's wrong with it and see if I can do anything for it. There's just one major problem. After finding out what's wrong with it and fixing it, what am I supposed to do with it after that? In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Bolens edger, and the problem is that according to the person that I got it from, it smokes when you start it, and not only that, but the rope is sometimes tough to pull. Now, I did ask them more questions about the machine, but most of that conversation won't help in diagnosing what's wrong with it. Although they did mention that more than likely, there's probably too much oil in the engine. Now, I'm going to try and repair this edger, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. So the first thing we need to do is to see the problem for ourselves, but more importantly, we need to look over the edger and make sure there isn't a massive hole in the engine or that something else isn't wrong with it. After that, I'd recommend checking on the oil and gasoline, and if both check out, we can then move on to a test start. I know that they said that it started and ran, but that doesn't mean they checked the fluids either, so I'd rather be safe than sorry. Now, we didn't get a full tank of free gasoline, but it's more than enough for a test start. So on first impression, it doesn't appear that the oil is overfilled, but to be sure, we need to wipe the dipstick clean first for a better reading. And after doing that, come to find out the oil level is exactly where it needs to be. It's not even over the line. So why is the engine smoking on startup then? Well, I guess we better start it up and see what it's doing. So as you just saw, when it started, it blew out blue smoke, which tells us it's burning oil, but just as quickly as it showed up, it pretty much disappeared. Now the most likely reason it's doing this is because oil is getting into the combustion chamber before startup, however after starting up there's no more oil to burn. Otherwise, if there was, which would happen if there's too much oil in the engine, it would have kept smoking, which it didn't. But there is one way this could happen even with the oil level being right at the full mark. And that is if you were to tip the engine forward, or basically where the front wheels are lower than the rear ones. What this does is allows the oil to cover part of the underside of the piston and could possibly allow some of the oil to make it past the rings. Now this sometimes happens with lawnmowers when they're being loaded into vehicles, but it never seems to do it any other time where it's not being transported somewhere. I will say trying to pick this edger up is rather awkward because of the way it's shaped, and dropping the front wheels is easy to do. So do I think that's what happened with this edger then? They kept transporting around and tipping the engine? I don't think so, but there are other ways to tip the engine. The other way would be if they stored the edger in a shed that happened to be high off the ground. They would then have to walk the edger down a ramp that could have been fairly steep, which could be enough to cause our problem. I could go on with other scenarios, but you get the idea. You don't have to agree with me, but it's tough to come up with different ideas with the oil level being right where it needs to be. But if you have another idea as to why it's smoking the way that it is, I'd like to hear it. Now if you didn't notice it, I tipped the edger on its back wheels to clean under it, and there was hardly any dirt there to clean. That tells me that this edger was not used all that much, but what we find later on doesn't add up. Now I won't spoil the surprise, but I'm sure there's a good explanation for what we find. So after a quick spray and rinse, I'll give it a couple hours for the water to dry up. Now I did cover up the openings in the muffler and the fuel cap to keep water from getting into them, but if you're really careful, you don't have to do this. Next, we need to take out the air filter because it should be sopping wet as well, but what we find is not good. So this is either chocolate cake or the filter material is breaking down, which is bad news. So it turns out whoever had this edger before took really good care of it because they oiled the filter like they should have. Unfortunately, as part of good maintenance, the filter needs to be serviced on some kind of schedule, otherwise it'll start to break down like this. At least the filter did a great job of keeping dirt from getting past it and getting into the carb and engine. The next item I want to check is whether or not the flywheel key is sheared, which could happen if the blade was stopped by concrete. But after taking off the starter cup and rotating the flywheel so you can see the top of the key, what we find is that it's in perfect condition. The top of the key should be lined up with the keyway in the flywheel and the seat in the crankshaft, which it is. Now if they weren't lined up even in the slightest, that would explain why the rope is really tough to pull, but we'll have to look somewhere else for the cause. Next, I want to do a compression test just to see if for some reason the compression was higher than normal, which would be another cause for the rope being tough to pull. While we're here, I'm also going to check the spark plug for any issues, but besides some oil on it, there's really nothing wrong with it. Now the compression tester will measure how much pressure the engine can make. And even though it's not as good as a leak down test, this should give us at least an idea on how healthy the engine might be. But before we do the test, I want to check and make sure that all the head bolts are tight. If you didn't know, the bolts near the bottom have a tendency to loosen over time. Once all the bolts are tight, we'll then install the tester into the spark plug opening, close the brake handle, and then use a drill to spin the engine over. So after several seconds, we've got our reading, and what we find is puzzling. The reading is 120 psi, which is a lot lower than what I was expecting for a machine this clean. Now getting a lower reading than expected is not the end of the world, but I do have to wonder if the rings are bad. Besides the piston rings, we also have to wonder if the valves might be leaking. This would be the time to pull out the leak down tester, but there's one other item I want to check instead. Now while the spark plug is out of the engine, I'm going to try burning off any extra oil and carbon. Of course, I could just replace it with a new one, but I don't like the idea of replacing good working parts for new ones. I'm also going to check the gap on the plug, and to do that, I'll be using the 25 thousandths feeler gauge. But of course, you're welcome to set yours to whatever value you think it should be. Now this one's good, so I'll install it back into the engine and then move on to another maintenance item. Now even though this is not a lawnmower and it'll never see that much work, wheel maintenance is still important. Now the procedure is pretty much the same, which is to take off the wheel and clean and lubricate the bolt. But if you can't take off the wheel or you don't want to, just spraying a thin lubricant around the wheel should work too. Now doing this kind of maintenance isn't tough to do, but it does take some drive to get it done. Now the front wheels look like quite a hassle to take off, but they seem to be working just fine, which means taking the easier route makes sense here. So of course the opposite works here as well. If the wheel is really difficult to spin, you'll have to take the wheel off for a very thorough cleaning before adding your lubricant. This would also be a great time to spray some of that lube into the spring area of the recoil just to make sure that it works like it should. Now if the recoil is really bad, I try to clean the spring area with some carb cleaner first before adding your lube. So the other item I wanted to check were the valve clearances, but this one is a lot different than your typical overhead valve setup. After opening the side cover next to the muffler, you'll then be able to see the valve stems and the springs. Now to make it easier to rotate the engine, I'm going to take the spark plug out, but you don't need to do this. Next, I'm going to rotate the engine so that one of the springs is fully compressed while the other one is not. I'll then take my 5 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge and see how it fits in the clearance for the one that's not compressed. I know it's really difficult to tell, but it just barely fits, which means the clearance here is around 5 thousandths of an inch, which is what I want it to be. We'll then rotate the engine again. This time we want the other one to be the one that's uncompressed so that we can test it too. Unfortunately, the feeler was much too loose in this clearance, which is not good. So for good measure, I'm going to keep checking the clearance until we find out what it really is. And after a minute or two of trying out different sizes, it turns out the clearance here is about 14 thousandths of an inch, which is much too high, at least in my book. Now the valve clearance being out of tolerance by this much could explain why the rope is really difficult to pull, but here's the kicker, there's not much we can do about it. Now because of the design of the valve train, we'd have to take the head off to try and service the valves, which is something a lot of people don't want to do. And even though it's only going to get worse over time, because it is an edger, it'll take years before we really have to worry about it. I know it sounds like I don't care to fix it, but you may not realize what will happen if we do. If I take the head off, I'll more than likely damage the head gasket, which means we'll need to replace it. That means another $10 we'll need to invest. Then if for some reason I can't lap the valve seat to close the clearance up, I might have to order a new valve, which is another $20. So you might be thinking that my hesitation is based only on the money, but it's not. It's time. The investment in time I can charge for, but getting it back is impossible. So as you just saw, it was easy to start and runs pretty well. That's the best part about these old Briggs flathead engines. They were just great engines, too bad they had to change them. Now, even though the oil looked pretty good, I'm going to take this opportunity to change it while the oil is still hot. And besides that, I have a suspicion that something might be wrong with the oil, which is causing our smoking issue. Now, I can't prove it, but if the oil was too thin to begin with, that might be allowing it to get past the rings. So on the safe side, I'd rather just replace it and eliminate that possibility. Now, if you haven't figured it out, just be careful and do not overfill the engine oil, otherwise the engine will most definitely be smoking while running. Now, if you think you might have overfilled the engine oil, just remove the dipstick and tip it over and collect a couple of ounces out of it. Then check the oil level again, and you can do this as many times as you need to. So what will happen if you leave it overfilled? Well, it depends on how much oil is in there. It could damage the engine. Now, if it's overfilled by 3 ounces, I wouldn't worry too much about it, as the engine will burn off the excess oil. But if you're asking it to burn off 10 to 12 extra ounces of oil, then the spark plug might end up covered in carbon. Either way, it's your choice on what you want to do with it, and no one's going to make you do something you don't want to do. Now, as for this one, I'm going to hold on to it for a while and use it, but it's mainly to check and see if it still has a smoking problem. Now, I don't mind using these, however, I'd rather not have to bring out another yard tool if I didn't need to. So my question is this something you'd like to have and use, or is my reasoning not to use it good enough for you too? Everyone has their own opinion, and for someone else, this might make more sense to use than using a string trimmer to edge with. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.